Another example is that 40% of man-made heat, of anthropogenic heat in cities is caused by traffic. So land use and transportation planning and vehicle electrification are actually critical levers for urban cooling. Hi, I'm Rushad Nanavatty. I work with RMI, or Rocky Mountain Institute, where I lead our program focused on cities. And you are listening to the Understanding the Future podcast.
Hello everyone, I am Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate with the Climate Center for Cities at the National Institute of Urban Affairs, and welcome to the Season 3 of Understanding the Future podcast. I have been working and studying in the field of sustainability and climate change for more than 8 years, and I have realized that I have a lot of questions on how we can build cities in India that are more climate focused. With Understanding the Future podcast, I interact with experts, entrepreneurs, and government officials to understand what it takes to bring all the different solutions to the ground, as well as how can systemic changes be developed on ground. We will further anchor all the topics being discussed with different skill sets required. This will help us understand the future of cities and future of work in Indian context. If you are tuning in for the first time, do check out our previous episodes. Also, don't forget to check out the Climate Practitioners India Network, a members-led solutions-oriented platform for climate practitioners across India. And join it through the show notes. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Season 3 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host, Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate with the Climate Center for Cities. And today we have with us Rushad Nanavatty. He is the Managing Director of Cities Program at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And today he will help us understand the topic of urban cooling in India. Welcome to the show, Rushad.
Thanks very much, Puneet. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for joining in, because I think we are just passing through the summer in India right now, while southern parts and western parts with heavy rainfall in Delhi right now, it's hot out there. So what do we exactly mean by urban cooling, and what are we actually picturing with urban cooling inside?
I think, put really simply, urban cooling is about providing people with thermal comfort in our cities. And the emphasis really here is on people. In India, fewer than 10% of people actually have access to air conditioning. So we have to find ways to cool, to provide thermal comfort, to essentially provide safe and healthy environmental conditions, not just in or to cool individual buildings, but to the city as a whole. India has an outdoor labor force that's about 400 million people, many of whom obviously work and live in cities. You're talking about people like day laborers, construction workers, street vendors, who don't have the luxury of being able to retreat into an air-conditioned space anytime conditions outside get dangerous or truly uncomfortable. And so we have to think about not just cooling individual buildings, we have to think about and work on actually lowering the temperature in the entire city or in the entire metropolitan area. And as I said, and I think might be quoting Shakespeare or misquoting Shakespeare here, what is a city but its people? So emphasizing, again, rather than the built environment abstractly, and recognizing that our cities are warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. And that's why working on the urban cooling agenda in particular is so important.
Absolutely. And as you're mentioning, cities are warming twice as fast. Why is that cities are the cause of such kind of what is exactly happening that is making cities more warmer than the rest of the area? Why how are we trying to envision, what are the different factors per se which cause this heating inside the city?
It's basically the urban heat island effect. And what the urban heat island effect is a phenomenon that causes more rapid and more severe warming in heavily built up environments. So cities have a preponderance of impervious and built up surfaces. So this is our asphalt on our roads, the concrete on our sidewalks and in our buildings. The waste heat that is generated from economic and industrial activities, quite significantly, the waste heat generated by air conditioners themselves, the waste heat generated by vehicles, especially vehicles with internal combustion engines. You have a concentration of all of these things that either absorb heat or actively emit heat in the urban environment. And that's what leads to this urban heat island effect. And that's what leads to this 2x warming in cities versus surrounding rural areas and ecosystems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's most of the things that anyone in urban area would be doing or dealing with on day-to-day basis.
Right.
So when we come down to India as a country, it's diverse. It has. So what are the other different kinds of challenges we are facing in tackling this problem right now? Where is the challenge currently properly grounded in that? Is it administration? Is it the build? How is it? What challenge are we exactly looking at when we are trying to solve this in India? In solving this as a problem.
Yeah. So the headline challenge is what we were just talking about, the fact that cities are warming so much faster than the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And in the context of rapid urbanization, that becomes an even bigger issue in the context of India. There were some recent estimates that suggested that before the end of the century, average temperatures in urban areas could be 4 degrees Celsius higher than they are today. And that represents a potentially catastrophic difference. Because the risk is non-linear, and this is the second challenge I'm going to get to.
Yeah.
So the best way or one of the best ways to assess heat stress is through what's called a wet bulb temperature. And I won't go into the details, but basically what that is a combined measure of heat and humidity, both of which affect human safety and thermal comfort. And the difference between 30 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature and a 35 degree Celsius wet bulb temperature is not a fractional difference. It's very literally the difference between life and death. So that population protection imperative is one of the most significant challenges we have with respect to this problem. And then there are huge costs associated with health and productivity and livelihoods. In addition to lives, heat has been called a silent killer. All-cause morbidity and mortality, basically illness and death from a variety of different conditions, spikes very, very significantly during heat waves. And those deaths and illnesses usually aren't attributed directly to heat, but it's a very, very significant underlying cause. And if we as a country are serious about poverty reduction, lifting up 200 million people in India living in extreme poverty out of it, considering those health and productivity impacts is really, really important. By some estimates, left unaddressed, the problem could rob India of something like 2% of GDP.
Wow. So it does look like quite an elaborate challenge in itself, especially looking at
it's almost in all different sectors that this will cause an issue. So how is it possible to actually solve this problem? How do we make sure that our cities don't get heated up so much if we can actually bring urban cooling as a mainstream thing for India?
So something that I think you and I have talked about in the past is the importance of taking a comprehensive, holistic, sort of whole systems approach to the problem. Because it is not one that we can just air condition our way out of. Because, as we were discussing, not everyone has access to air conditioning. And secondly, because of the climate impact associated with air conditioning, ACs are our most common response to the problem, the most common adaptive response, but they're also a very, very significant cause of the problem. So under business as usual, they could consume as much power as the entire US, German, and Japanese economies do today. The most common refrigerant we use in IACs, and quite often is leaked by IACs, is nearly 2,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a global warming agent. So understanding the connections between the built environment, the energy system, nature, and being able to work across those silos is really, really important. And I'll point maybe to a couple of examples. Heat plumes that are generated by air conditioners exacerbate the urban heat island effect. So it's important to not just serve cooling needs efficiently, but it's also important to reduce those requirements. Another example is that 40% of man-made heat, of anthropogenic heat in cities, is caused by traffic. So land use and transportation planning and vehicle electrification are actually critical levers for urban cooling. Third example, vegetation, trees, and water bodies have a profound cooling effect. So restoration ecology and forestry in an urban context is important, not just from, say, a biodiversity or a carbon sequestration perspective. It's also really important from a cooling perspective.
Yeah.
And if we're serious about addressing this problem in our cities, we need to be thinking about all of these.
Absolutely. No, I do like these examples as well, because I think they are quite interesting to say that how much of effect it has. So, as you mentioned, that looking at it comprehensively, maybe we can start from the smallest piece in the puzzle, which are the buildings in any city. Now, let's take maybe one by one each of these steps forward, and what is something that can be done with buildings? How can that be done to make sure that we are able to solve this problem, at least on that level?
Sure. And happy to start in that direction. So I would say that it's the smallest unit you're thinking about is even smaller than the building. It's the individual, it's the person, and then the room, even before the building. So when you're talking about the scale of the room, the scale of the family, one of the things we're talking about is super efficient, climate-friendly cooling equipment. And it's really important that we have enforced standards in place that take the worst performing, most inefficient air conditioning units off the market. You need a combination of financing solutions, perhaps other incentives, and effective marketing and communications to move buyers towards the most climate-friendly, efficient products on the market, and institutional buyers. You need a workforce that's trained to install and maintain and dispose of these air conditioners correctly. One thing that we've learned is that if a super efficient air conditioner is installed incorrectly, it can be worse than a 2 or 3-star unit. And you need commitment. We need commitment from a massive consolidated, I think it's something like a $150 or $200 billion global air conditioning industry to actually start solving for efficiency and climate in a very serious way, not just for sales and profits. The other critical technology piece right now is our fans, which are the most commonly used active cooling technology in India. If you think of ACs as the massive looming problem that we have to address, the fans are the here and now problem that we need to address. And there's, again, a vast difference between the most efficient units on the market, which are these BLDC or brushless direct current fans, and regular fans. So, that's kind of the smallest piece of the puzzle, the cooling equipment itself. Then taking it up a level to the building, I like to say that air conditioning in inefficient building is like opening a tap of water into a leaky bucket. And good building design, on the other hand, and construction minimizes the need for any kind of active or mechanical cooling. And that includes things like, building orientation, insulation, cool surface materials, high performance windows, shading structures, ventilation, and, thermal mass. That provides some inertia or protection against big temperature fluctuations. And it's worth pointing out that none of these interventions are new. In India's case, quite often many of these measures are embedded in age-old vernacular building styles, many of which we've unfortunately lost. And we also have a modern set of tools in the form of building codes and standards that we can use to ensure that our buildings are really built to ideally net zero carbon and thermally efficient standards. On the building side, the other really promising set of solutions are cool roofs. So these are materials that you can paint or coat your roof with that can make a difference even when other building efficiency measures aren't viable. Places like slums and informal settlements, or where building codes are effectively ignored. So, when sunlight hits a black roof, 60% or more of that energy heats the building or heats the city's air. That number is less than 10% when you're talking about a simple white roof. And there's some super promising new solutions and materials emerging from labs that are as efficacious as an AC. So, literally provide as much cooling impact as an air conditioning unit. So those are the building level solutions.
I was just asking about the same thing. What is the next level then?
Yeah, so the next level up is a collection of buildings or neighborhood. And here there are a couple of interventions that are really promising. On the active cooling side of things, district cooling systems, which serve many buildings with a single central chiller. So you can think of this as one massive air conditioning unit that serves multiple buildings. And it does that through a network of pipes and delivers massive efficiencies related to scale and related to the diversity of loads. So when one building's air conditioning requirements are really high, another may be low. And so you can size a system that in aggregate is much, much smaller than one that would be required if you were serving each of those buildings separately. And critically, district cooling systems don't exacerbate that urban heat island effect that we're talking about. So these really need to be the default technology choice in any large new commercial or mixed-use neighborhood scale development where air conditioning is going to be a feature. Also at the sort of neighborhood or street scale, there is a really important place for smart surfaces. So a typical asphalt road will absorb 95% of the sunlight that lands on it. Concrete absorbs something like 75%. If you can increase the reflectivity of those surfaces and actually the permeability of those surfaces, you could reduce surface temperatures by up to 5 degrees Celsius, which is a huge difference when you're talking about neighborhoods that are dominated by these materials. At a similar scale, urban nature has a really vital role to play. So urban parks and forests can be 7 degrees cooler than treeless parts in the city. The effect of that cooling is not just confined to the park or the forest itself, can actually extend to, 3/4 or nearly a kilometer away from it. Just having a tree-lined street, and you see this in Delhi where you are, can make a 3-degree difference. So really, a really important place for urban nature. And then finally, when you're thinking at the metropolitan or the city scale, there are ways to weave heat resilience actually into the city planning itself.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting because I never knew that the line of tree on road can actually help in also reducing 3 degrees Celsius or something, which is quite helpful because I think most of the traffic generally is going around that line of tree, and that might be one of the causes of pollution per se as well. So now coming, as you just mentioned about the city scale and planning. So how can planning help in this whole, like what can be done while we are doing planning so that it can actually be taken care of in at least the expansion of the city, because if it's already brownfield, it might need much more work, but if it's whenever the city is expanding, how can planning support in this whole ecosystem development?
In several ways. So first thing to recognize is that urban populations are growing really fast, and unfortunately, urban land area is growing even faster. And so affecting patterns of growth and development is critical for any number of reasons. Critical from an equity perspective and a transportation burden perspective. Critical because you want to obviously minimize land consumption. You want to minimize the embodied carbon associated with sprawl. You want to keep cities essentially more compact, so that distances are smaller and we're not as reliant on cars and other vehicles as we would need to be. And addressing those patterns of development or affecting those patterns of development is really critical from a heat resilience perspective as well. As I mentioned, 40% of anthropogenic heat in cities is generated from vehicles. So compact and mixed use kind of development is really, really important. The other thing planning related is building orientation and street orientation, which can either help you harness things like prevailing winds that can help lower the temperature of a city or keep a city cooler, or you can orient buildings and streets in a way that prevent that from happening. And then perhaps most importantly, optimizing the distribution of green and blue space in a city in the context of planning is incredibly important. And incredibly important from an equity perspective, because this pattern sort of repeats itself all over the world. Poorer neighborhoods, lower income neighborhoods almost invariably have a higher proportion of built up surfaces and fewer trees, less green space, or less high quality green space. And that's certainly true of India as well. So those are a few of the ways in which you can kind of consider or embed heat resilience or heat resilience logic into major planning exercises.
Absolutely, that sounds pretty good. But then I think now coming to that, okay, we have understood that what are the different levels and how each level currently has some or the other solution which can be taken up. It's not like we have to reinvent the wheel for doing all these things. But I think one of the next challenge that we can think about is the cross-sectional administration opportunities that are required in making sure that this can actually work. Because especially in India, when we look at it, your urban sector or urban local bodies is a separate unit, while your electricity comes from a separate unit. And those things don't talk. And then you need industries to facilitate all the different kinds of technologies which will require a huge finance per se. So how can those things be solved in context of, specifically when you're talking about Indian context, because I'm sure that every city or every nation will have their own different challenges.
So the first thing I'd say is that India is ahead of the curve on this. It was the first country in the world to very clearly articulate heat resilience and sustainable urban cooling, sustainable cooling in general as a national priority, in that it was the first country in the world to actually develop a national cooling action plan. So there is a policy framework that can inspire and help guide action. And that now needs to basically translate into a number of different stakeholders realizing and taking very seriously that heat resilience is a part of their job descriptions. It is their responsibility, regardless of the government department or sector in which they are working. It's really important that people across a number of different stakeholder groups start to embed this heat resilience and climate logic into their operations. So at the local government level, it's important to, and actually even at the national level, really important to have robust data and be able to visualize the impact. Identify the areas that are subject to the most heat stress and have the greatest vulnerability, so you can target investments and programs and projects toward them. The other very significant lever that public institutions have, and actually large institutional buyers on the private sector side, is their buying power. And so you want procurement policies to consider things like total cost of ownership, environmental impact, ideally climate impact. And at the local government, at the implementation level with respect to local government, we need to give very clear guidance in the form of, say playbooks or detailed guidelines on the implementation of various projects or interventions. Urban Nature is a great example. One of the things that we need are really robust guidelines around things like species selection, planting, the long-term management and care of natural assets or trees in a city. So that's, those are some of the things that come to mind at the local government level. At the national level, the single most important maybe policy and regulatory lever are minimum energy performance standards, which govern cooling equipment. And ideally, you want those minimum energy performance standards to be set as close to the best available technology as possible. If there's a big gap between the most efficient units that you have available on the market and the least efficient that the market or that regulation allows, then just because of the nature of consumer behavior, just because those worst performing units are cheaper, people will gravitate toward them, even if total life cycle costs associated with buying an inefficient air conditioner are higher. So that minimum energy performance standard and labeling, that's a critical intervention. Similarly, on the national policies and standards side of things, policies and guidelines in place that encourage the right patterns of urban development that we were just talking about are really, really important. So moving away from the public sector, thinking about the private sector, private developers And construction companies, in the context of all of the construction that is going to happen in India over the next 20, 30, 50 years, is absolutely critical. Again, they have tremendous buying power, and many of them are building entire communities, mini cities, essentially from scratch. And they have a really profoundly important opportunity to design and build net zero, thermally efficient, cool neighborhoods and communities. And it's really encouraging to see commitments from some real estate developers in that regard. The Lodha Group comes to mind. And that's an example that I'm familiar with only because RMI has been working with them. I'm sure there are many, many more. And then you mentioned, Puneet, industry. The air conditioning industry in particular is heavily consolidated. It's a $150 billion to $200 billion global industry. And to date, they have not prioritized R&D in service of efficiency and climate friendliness. They've responded to the market signals that basically tell them that consumers demand the cheapest products that they can put out. But in the context of more and more corporations taking their climate responsibilities seriously, they need to commit to doing the right thing. So a couple of years ago, in partnership with the Indian government and others, RMI worked on the Global Cooling Prize, which surfaced technologies, room air conditioning or residential air conditioning technologies that were 5 times more climate friendly than the standard or most commonly sold products on the market. And we now need to get industry to commit to actually commercializing those technologies and ideally help match supply with demand. Because if those manufacturers, if those industry players have some sort of surety or guarantee of demand waiting for them, then they will be willing to commit to producing the technology that's aligned with our climate goals and aspirations. So there's a really important role for each of those stakeholder groups to play. It's a complex issue, but one of the upshots of that is that everybody has to treat this as a part of their responsibilities.
No, absolutely. I do agree that it's all stakeholders' hands in it, and that's, I think, one stakeholder I would like to come back to is individuals that you mentioned the first, and the behavior change that is required. Because, you also mentioned that if a super efficient AC is not used properly, it can be worse than 2 or 3-star AC. Now, if that is the case, how can we actually change behavior? Because unless and until it is made so easy for people to just switch on and off, everyone might not be adapt to that amount of technological new technology per se as well. So how can behavior in general be taken into account while we are taking this design?
So, I think there are I have a few different thoughts on this topic. Consumers are, I think it's unrealistic to expect that consumers are going to actively consider climate when they're making purchasing decisions or thinking about cranking up or down the dial on an air conditioner at home. With respect to any individual sort of hierarchy of needs and priorities, the unfortunate fact is that, climate and sustainability and energy system considerations are not going to feature high on that list. So you have to make it easy for them to make the right choice. And that's where policy, regulation, innovative business models have a really important role to play. So one of the things I mentioned is that that consumers generally will buy the lowest priced option available to them, even if that's going to be more expensive in the long term. Consumers have what's called implicitly really, really high discount rates. So you could buy, if you're affronted with two choices, and one air conditioner is, say, 1,000 rupees more expensive than the other, but that unit will save you 1,000 rupees in the first year itself, and then obviously in every year subsequent to that, consumers will still quite often usually opt for the cheaper unit. And so financing solutions and, obviously allied to that, communication and marketing that can actually influence behavior changes is really important. One of the things that a few utilities in India have explored and we think holds a lot of promise is utility on-bill financing, basically a pay-as-you-go model that enables you to pay for super efficient appliances or equipment as part of your standard electricity or utility bill itself. So you're taking that first cost premium essentially out of the equation. And that's in the interest of the consumer because it will save them money. But critically, it's in the interest of the utility company and the power system as a whole in India, because you're obviously reducing load and investment requirements.
Yeah.
So that's an example of, nudging or making it easier for the consumer to actually do the right thing, to make the right choice. You can get progressively more sophisticated from there. So demand response represents a really, promising kind of area of innovation as well. And you can think of demand response as sort of two types: behavioral demand response and an automated demand response. But what it's about is basically empowering consumers essentially to alter the operation of their cooling equipment or their air conditioners in order to serve, say, grid needs, or you can just say societal needs more broadly speaking, in exchange for some sort of reward. And so you can imagine, say, pre-cooling a room or a building when electricity prices are low, when demands on the grid are lower, and turning that AC off when the opposite is the case, when demands on the grid and load is higher. And so there are a number of ways that you can, through these sorts of financing and business model innovations, that you can encourage the kind of consumer behavior that you want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for new business models and especially with a lot of new technology coming in and education coming in, of utmost importance over here as well. And I think coming to one of the last questions that we generally ask on these lines is more on the lines of, okay, now we do understand that this is a problem and this is how it is functioning. What kind of skill sets do we need to make sure that we can solve this problem? Because this problem pans around across all different areas. But maybe to, let's say, for next 3 years or 5 years, what are the major skill sets required that these things can kickstart to make sure urban cooling can be, while it is an important mandate and we have a mission already, it goes into more of a fifth year sort of thing.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily about creating entirely new skill sets or people acquiring entirely new skills. It is fundamentally about lots of different people in lots of different occupations treating this, as I said, as part of their jobs. And that ranges from the service technicians that install and maintain and dispose of our cooling equipment. It involves building design people in the building design and construction business. So we're building thermally efficient, high performance buildings. It spans infrastructure and public works, so that they're actively considering heat resilience in their material choices and in their designs. We talked about the importance of good urban planning and considering heat resilience alongside everything else that planners traditionally consider around access and equity and livability. Transportation planners have to consider this in the context, as I said, of vehicular traffic being a big part of the urban heat island effect problem. Forestry and restoration ecology, people need to be part of the solution given the potential positive impact that nature-based solutions could have. Even utility executives and employees in the context of things like utility on-bill financing and demand response that encourages the uptake of super efficient cooling equipment. So we need people across each of those areas, occupations, skills to be thinking about and actively working on the problem. As important with respect to skill sets is the ability to think and work across silos. And that's something that you were alluding to. So the public works person needs to not just consider, say, durability and cost when they're resurfacing a road. They actually need to think about a surface that reduces the urban heat island effect. When you're building a road, don't just build a road. Make a complete street with protected bike and pedestrian infrastructure, with trees. When the forestry department is executing on its plans, don't just have a numerical planting target, which is, it's easy to point to success and say, oh, we planted 100,000 or a million or 3 million trees. It's really important that they consider prioritizing those investments and those efforts in neighborhoods with the highest heat stress and vulnerability. So that ability to kind of think and work across silos is a really, really critical skill if we are to embed this sort of logic into a city's operations, into the operations of private sector actors that have a really important role to play.
Absolutely, I do agree that each level will need, and then the across siloed approach also will be required to make sure that we are able to proceed ahead on these lines as well. But if I have missed out on any point that you think should be covered under this topic, please feel free to put it at this point before we close the podcast.
I think I just maybe want to emphasize what's at stake here. First and foremost, lives. If you look at maps of projected heat stress, there's 200 million people in India that could potentially be exposed to deadly heat waves in the mid 2030s if we, absent serious effort and intervention. So there's massive human impact associated with it, and obviously for the positive or for the negative, if you get it right, it could have a huge effect with respect to the country's population reduction and development goals. You have 2% of GDP at stake, as I mentioned earlier, 35 million jobs, or the equivalent of 35 or 34 million jobs. So massive impact with respect to India's growth and development aspirations. So there's, it's just hugely important that we get this right. And as I said, that we treat this as everybody's responsibility that touches upon these systems in any meaningful way.
Absolutely, I do agree that this is somewhere a low-hanging fruit in itself for India, that everything's available. We have those guns, we have the races, It's just that how do we make sure that they are there in the market? We have those building bylaws as well for state. And how do we make sure that those can be implemented in a better way? And where if we can do those things, it will be one of the biggest achievements to make sure that there is a good amount of mitigation already in place for it going forward. So thank you so much. It was absolutely interesting hearing about this topic because the amount of layers it has and the amount of depth it has. Thank you so much for listening.
My pleasure, Puneet. Thanks a ton for having me, and always happy to engage on this topic.
Thank you for tuning into the podcast. Do subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and follow us on all social media channels. For more details about the Climate Center for Cities and registration on Climate Practitioners India Network, click on the link in the show notes. The episode is conceptualized and produced by Punit Gandhi. A big thank you to the whole team at C-Cube and NIUA for supporting the development of the podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode.